Welcome back to the Stewart Podcast, everybody. Today, our guest is a retired elevator mechanic that became interested in the money creation process employed by commercial banks after watching an animated video entitled Money as Debt years ago. Since then, our guest, Jeff Etter, read extensively on the topic of money and even went back to school for micro and macroeconomic courses. Surprisingly, his skill set as a troubleshooter in complex elevator systems translated very well when mapping out the financial system as it pertains to government finance. He co-founded Progressive Money Canada in 2015, and the official website, progressivemoney.ca, was created in 2018. We're going to be talking about how money can be used for the public good, the problems with the source of money creation, debt, inflation, and what the future could look like if we simply follow a few simple steps to liberate the people from unjust central banking schemes. Let's get Jeff Eder in here on the Ben Stewart Podcast. Here we are. Jeff Eder, thank you so much for joining.
I should make one correction. The name's actually pronounced Eder.
Eder, okay.
I should have mentioned that before. But
the most important thing, the pronunciation of your name. So the rest of the bio is solid, ladies and gentlemen, but Jeff is our guest. Thank you so much for joining us from BC, Canada. Is that right?
Yes. Thanks, Ben. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Just a few weeks back, we had Harrison Schultz on the show. Everyone might remember that. And Harrison was the one who connected us with Jeff Eder. And that's why we're getting into the topic that we're getting into today. Everyone will remember that Harrison is quite an activist. And today, it's very interesting to hear somebody that was an elevator mechanic turned. I mean, I guess what would be the title? It's not economist, would it be, or monetary researcher?
No, it's one and the same. So, also, in addition to being interested in the money creation process, of course, in that you have to learn about economics. So, I was kind of curious as to why all these financial experts got these predictions wrong all the time. Because it always, to me, was confusing, especially like the terminology. I wasn't familiar with that, so I never knew really what they were talking about. So I became more curious about it, and as my research went deeper and deeper, I realized one of the missing puzzles that the majority of mainstream economists have is they really don't understand the money creation process that commercial banks employ. So that's when and I don't know how many books that I've read on the topic right now, but I also went back to school. I took a bunch of other topics too. I like being in school. But anyways, that's where I am today.
Do you think, so just on that topic there, you said most financial advisors, they don't really understand the monetary system. Do you think that's just ineptitude of a very complex system? Do you think any of it's by design, so it's easier to manipulate a system where people don't fully understand it? What do you make of that?
I don't think it's ineptitude, and actually Gordon could comment on this too, because he's taken those same courses that I've taken. So basically this is what people are taught. So they're coming at the whole monetary system under a false premise, under a false understanding of how the thing works. So if you don't really understand how something works, then, how can you fix it? And I don't think there's any kind of the conspiratorial aspect of it. I think it just kind of naturally evolved into what it is today. Because when you look at the complexity of the financial system, and it increases, it's getting more and more complex. It's because the people at the top manipulating the numbers, it's advantageous to them, to keep this system so under this veil of complexity. And as we talked earlier, wrote a paper on it, the costs of money creation and complexity. So I also did a short video on the money creation page on what restricts the amount of money that banks can create. So it's no longer fractional reserve banking. Even when it was fractional reserve banking, it didn't actually operate that way. So what they have now is capital adequacy requirement ratios. But man, you start looking into that, it's like, whoa, it is incredibly complex. And there's like a 14-minute video that I created. There's PDF supplements that go along with it that explain how complicated it really is. So you want to stay away from that. The main thing is to understand is that the majority of money in circulation is created by privately owned commercial banks through the loans process.
Yeah. And that'll be the very next question about how money is created and how it's gotten to the point that it's gotten to today. Like, I didn't know that about the fractional reserve not really being fractional reserve banking anymore. I'd love to know what that shift was. The only thing I want to like understand a little better, and maybe it's just the way that like you said it. Like, I know that when you say conspiratorial, the mind often wants to go to some of the more extreme conspiracies when conspiracy really is colluding in private, two or more people colluding in private for personal gain, whatever that might be, conspiring in some way. So if it's not ineptitude and there's this almost intentional complexity to kind of keep it so complex that once it gets explained to people, like a financial advisor, such as what Gordon was doing, once it gets explained to people, if it's not ineptitude, what else is it other than conspiracy? I mean, like, I don't feel like we need to go too far down that rabbit hole, but to me, that sounds like almost textbook definition of conspiracy. Would you agree?
Under your definition, yes, I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. That's as deep as we need to go. But that to me,
just one point to add though, Ben, is that it makes perfect sense. It's, they've got this incredible position and they want to protect their turf. It's very basic human nature stuff.
yeah, I feel that. I definitely feel that self-preservation is deeply wired inside of us, and I definitely get that. When times are, well, let's say, like, what our ancestors used to have to do, like protecting against times when they're lean, when you get an abundance or a surplus of something that could help you, perhaps the very first thought in your mind isn't, well, let's go and distribute this out to as many people, outside of my family and the people that I care about the most. So, I mean, conspiracy doesn't have to mean this being hell bent on disadvantaging others, but to me, like, that's kind of that's the line, is tinkering. Maybe there is a bit of inept or ignorance in the sense of um yeah, I mean, like, not really understanding that the impact that this system, as complex as it has gone, the amount of have nots that we have, the amount of people that the current banking system disadvantages, um, maybe had far more of an impact than was truly intended, but the impact seems to be there. And I don't know if you want to comment on that. To me, I'm still wrapping my mind around how did we get to this place without trying to find, like, who do I point my finger at? It's more or less, how do we identify and diagnose the problems that we're experiencing? Because this isn't just a problem in Canada or in the United States, it's global. So if we can better diagnose what the problem is without making certain people the scapegoats, we can at least come to a better understanding of what are the solutions, which you have some solutions that we'll get into a little bit later on. But first, I would say, like, let's go deeper into the problem, like where it starts. Do you think the problem starts with money creation itself?
Yeah, by allowing privately owned commercial banks that extraordinary privilege to create money through the loans process. So banks are a company just like any other company. They're not evil. They provide a function, but that's how they're trained. they're like, they want to maximize profit. So profit comes before everything else. So by us giving banks, commercial banks, that extraordinary privilege to create almost all the money in existence, that means there's always a profit motive attached to it. And that is almost, for the most part, counter to the public good. For example, for us to fund anything like our parks, Medicare for All in Canada, there's a large percentage of our federal taxes that go to pay that. So we have to, pay for it ourselves. Whereas, the PMC proposal is that we allow the Bank of Canada to create that money debt-free and just spend it into existence. So this benefits you in several ways. It reduces the debt in society. Yeah, I think, did I go off topic at all, or?
No, no. So what my mind's now reeling on is like, so so here in the United States, and I don't fully know the history there, but here in the United States, I forget the articles and the sections of it, but Congress, according to the Constitution, Congress is supposed to print the money. Is that correct?
No, the Congress never is involved in actual printing of money. And plus, that's a misnomer too, printing money. It's typing numbers into databases. Okay, so the majority of money in circulation right now is digital, as you can easily confirm, you and Gord. I mean, how often do you actually make a cash transaction?
Not very often anymore.
Very, very rarely. So the majority of money floating around is actually digital.
Understood, but like, at least this is what Harrison was talking about on the podcast. The Constitution.
The Congress does not make the money. It's banks that make the money.
I understand that's how it is now, but isn't that the more recent creation? Isn't that the more recent? I mean, like, how was it at the dawn of the country with the Constitution being?
Well, no, I'm not exactly sure what Harrison might have been referring to then, but it's always been almost always the private banking system that's been in control of the financial system. There was like a reprieve, like issuing the greenback, like in the Second World War or whatever. That was very successful. Of course, bankers, as soon as they realize they're getting cut out of the thing, they want to get back into the system again. So again, they're protecting their turf. So that's one instance of it. If you go way back, like, early century, like with the goldsmith's tale, when fractional reserve banking first developed, and that's what that video that I saw, Money is Debt, does very well. It explains kind of the origins of banking and fractional reserve. So basically, the goldsmith, took in all the gold and any kind of money you had and safeguarded, because it was awkward and clumsy to deal with. Like, you have all this heavy gold in packets, when you want to make all these different transactions. So he would give vouchers. So instead of, them carrying these bags of gold around, then they started to exchange vouchers, which eventually became banknotes. And that's kind of, the origins. But, it's really the private banking system that's always been in control. The people tried to rattle it away from private banks, but never been totally successful.
Okay, all right. So maybe back to the fractional reserve. So the concept that you mentioned in that film, Money is Debt, and I've seen that as well. It's that animated kind of cartoon one, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that film, they basically went through that history with where the goldsmith would then hand out these vouchers, and then they started noticing that people weren't coming in to grab their gold. They were basically exchanging vouchers out there at the market, and then other people would come back with the vouchers that were given to other people, sometimes to pull out gold, but sometimes not. So they were realizing that they had these reserves of gold, and what they began realizing is like they could use that to loan out. And I'm not really sure who they would loan that out to, maybe other, I guess, people or other banks in that respect. But they were basically loaning out money that wasn't theirs to begin with, because of the fact that most people weren't coming in to exchange their vouchers back for their gold, correct?
Correct.
So what
Yeah.
changed? You said that it's not really a fractional reserve system anymore because that's still what.
Because it never actually did work that way. Even when there was fractional reserve, like in recent history, um, really the loan process would create money first, and then banks would go looking for reserves later, and they'd have like a 2-week period in which to do so. So Gordon would be familiar with this in macroeconomic textbooks. They explain fractional reserve and saying that the bank can only lend out when it has excess reserves, but that's completely untrue. And it's admitted by a guy named Alan Holmes, which was, part of the Federal Reserve. He said, yeah, no, it's just, that doesn't work that way. The loan creation process creates the money first, then we go looking for reserves later. And in Canada, it's even like we don't have fractional reserve, but we have like a liquid requirement ratio. And banks, and again, I cover this too on the website, they have to report it like every 3 months. So who knows what's going on in between the time that they report it until the time they manipulate numbers and make it do whatever they want, basically. So that's also, a limitation, but it's just there's so many ways around that limitation, as I explain in that video about capital adequacy requirement ratios, which is on the money creation page.
Okay. And definitely for everyone listening, please go to that website and dive into. There's a wealth of information there. There's videos. I just perused the money myths there. There's 3 money myths. Really good to look at. So the Bank of Canada is the central bank in Canada. It's our equivalent to the Federal Reserve, correct?
Yes, the Federal Reserve System. So the Federal Reserve System is slightly more complicated because it encompasses 12 regional banks. But the Board of Governors, I think they're in Washington, D.C. or something like that. There's like 7 Board of Governors that actually run the whole Federal Reserve System. And each one of those banks has different responsibilities. For example, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, it holds the government's account, the Treasury's general account at that one particular bank. Other banks have different responsibilities. So it's a little more complicated, whereas the Bank of Canada, we have one bank. And so, the government's accounts there at the Bank of Canada. So it's much easier to illustrate how it actually functions compared with the United States. But the systems they directly parallel each other.
Okay. Yeah. I looked at that map. It's pretty interesting because out of all the territories, if you cut the country, at least the US, in half, all but one of those 12 sectors or 12 Federal Reserve banks is like one of is in San Francisco and all the rest of them are on the other half of the country, just because of how the sectors sit and where the banks sit in those sectors. But I guess the reason why I bring that up, the parallel between the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve, is because something that I had only recently come to understand is, so you're mentioning the private banks, the commercial banks are the ones that, let's say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how money is created. You come to me with a business idea, and I say, the bank, I say, I like you, I like your idea. Here's $1 million. So, $1 million goes onto my ledger, which is like, you owe me $1 million, and I've, lent you $1 million, and the reverse way on your ledger. And then from there, that $1 million is created on a screen. So that's money that this commercial bank, not the central bank, but the commercial bank created, plus whatever interest is there. And that money isn't created. This part I just came to understand about why the need for growth, GDP and economic growth, is because the money that's produced, the money for the interest to pay back the interest isn't produced. And that's why we need economic growth year by year. But to stay on point, here I was thinking that it was the central banks that were creating the money, but in fact, it's the commercial banks.
Correct. And again, Gordon can speak to this because the macroeconomic textbooks, that's what they allude to. So they treat commercial banks as just intermediaries, meaning just moving money from one place to another place. But they are the originators of the majority of money in circulation.
Yeah,
So
because
again,
a big reason why you would think obviously you don't want to state that out loud is because there'd be obvious conflict of interest.
yes.
So explain that, Gordon. Explain, like, at least, unless you don't want to say the quiet part loud. This is
I
a
mean,
show.
well, just the idea is called moral hazard in finance, but there's a reason we had the Glass-Steagall Act to separate retail banking and investment banking. And we just became more and more basically wild, wild west with these sort of loose investments and trading. We had the, subprime mortgage crisis. We had ninja loans. And we just became more and more reckless with allowing retail, which used to just be, you put your money in, you get a loan. It was very just cut and dry. And the investment guys were their own whole of the world. And that's when you had all these mergers. You had Bank of America buy Merrill Lynch. You had JP Morgan Chase by JP Morgan. You had all these big players who were basically just bad gamblers. Essentially all these major investment firms got bought by major banks. And you just saw this more and more of this conflict of interest, and it was never supposed to be that way. Bottom line is it's supposed to be kind of there's supposed to be checks and balances. There's supposed to be sort of a separation so that this wouldn't occur, so that you wouldn't have these sort of risky type personalities getting involved with people's fucking IRAs and pension funds and things that their entire life have been put into.
Yeah, and I mean, just for a second, just for the audience, and what's going through my mind is this too big to fail mentality around 2008, where these huge companies that, maybe I'm not getting the wording exactly correct, but not so profitable companies had to be bailed out because they were critical. But that's not how the system is supposed to work. So that's kind of decoupling it from the reality, so the reality of the economic system. And that, to me, sounds like it was just kicking an inevitable can down the road. But like, to kind of get back on our you, Jeff. Well, go ahead.
Well, one other key thing with just that, Ben, is that when that happened, it also really showed the true colors of who's in control, right? It's really the private banksters who are in control of the Bernanke's and the Greenspans and the Fed. It's all this revolving door of all these same people, same, boardrooms, same country clubs that share these similar positions, just like in DC, and you have that in the lobbyist sector and various other sectors. Finance and the Federal Reserve, the SEC, there's this constant cesspool of similar personality types exchanging positions. And you basically saw, though, the obviousness of, like you just said, we should allow those companies to fail, and better banks like Wells Fargo or some other bank that's better would step up in those banks' place. But they said, no, we're too big to fail. We're too systemically critical to the entire system. If we go, the system goes. And they basically kind of had this sort of financial gun to the Treasury Department's head, as well as Obama, whether, you get into their whole conflict. But like, it just shows you who really runs things. That was a moment where everyone's like, oh, wow, like, we've pretty much, like, we are now the bank's, bitch, to put it not so lightly.
There's something I'll add to that too, Gordon. Absolutely true. There's kind of an interesting section in the book that Too Big to Fail. I think Andrew Sorkin wrote it. But there's a section in there that Barney Frank was the head, the banking committee investigating all this. And of course, this is when the Fed was bailing out all these banks. And again, this is typing numbers into databases, right? They didn't have like a big chunk of cash or gold waiting anywhere. They're just their lender of last resort, and they've been given that privilege. Their lender, they create that money by typing numbers into databases. So I guess it was Barney Frank, when they're talking about this big bailout for the commercial banks, kind of leaned over, and this was sourced too. There's a bunch of people that heard this, leaned over to Ben Bernanke, who was, the head of the Reserve at that time. And he said, "Do you guys really have enough money?" Which shows the total ignorance of how the system actually functions.
Right.
And this guy was the head of the committee investigating banking. So, and you probably have some idea now, like how many people in Congress are just from complete nuts to just ignorant of how our system actually works, which is kind of scary. And like this, that's why I'm kind of doing this, is because, man, everybody should know this. This should be taught in grade school, but it isn't. And it's taught wrong in like macroeconomic courses, right up to the highest levels of academia. So the conspiracy thing, again, I don't even want to get into the conspiracy part, but
For sure.
that's the question.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many rabbit holes I could go down there, but I'll just keep it on point. As I was surfing your website, what I really liked were these, money myths, and the three of them was: number one, banks use my money or assets to make loans. The second one is it's my money, and the third one is money is safe in the bank. If you were only going to field one, I would ask you, why is money is safe in the bank a myth? Why is that third one a myth? But let me know if you want to touch base on each of them.
Sure. Well, the third one is, I think from 1970 to 2010, the IMF recorded like 425 like banking and sovereign debt crises. So that's as far as, the number three. And the other part that everybody's heard this. And Gordon, tell me your own experience. If you heard this, where you've heard a professor or some financial guy saying, yeah, banks, lend out deposits. Have you ever heard that, Gordon?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while, but yeah, rings a bell.
Okay, so that's a common talking point when they talk about the financial system. Yeah, the banks lend out deposits, right? Well, here's something anecdotal that you can use to refute that, and it's inarguable. So, for example, Ben, let's say you just notice you're perusing your bank account and say you got $10,000 in there, and all of a sudden it goes down to $5,000. I didn't take $5,000 out. And you go to your local bank and you go to the bank manager and you say, hey, what's going on here? I had $10,000 in my bank yesterday. What happened to $5,000? And the bank manager replied to you and said, oh, it's okay. We're just lending out your deposits. Okay. Has that ever happened to you once in your entire life?
No, but I imagine it's because they just don't digit.
Has it happened to any of your friends or family? Has that ever happened once? No. So it never happens. That means that banks do not lend out deposits. And you can see, like in your own account, and again, they're just digital entries, right? But your bank account it's pretty good system, like my money doesn't go missing unless, I do something myself. So that's something that can refute. But it makes you question these talking points that you hear in the financial world, like banks lend out deposits. Okay, there's something. You don't have to do any research at all, but just ask them that question. The guy that's saying to you, lend out deposit, will the bank ever lend out your deposits? Do you have any proof of that? Of course, there is none, because it doesn't happen.
That definitely makes sense. And then, did you touch all three of them? There was, it's my money, but that one.
Oh yeah, it's your money. Well, it's really the banks. As soon as you put it into a bank, it's really the bank's money, with a promise to, like in demand deposits, they promise to give you money whenever you request it. But if there's a problem with the banking system, that particular bank, they shut the doors and you can't get your money out. Mm-hmm. Like I said, there was like 425 debt crises between 1970 and 2010. So how is that possible that you actually created this value? You had actually go out and do something, and you say you're a saver, and you got like, $90,000 in the bank, and all of a sudden the bank closed and you can't get your money out. And that's why this should also be instructive to people that, okay, so how much, you must be some kind of protection. Well, there is. Like the Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation, it protects you up to $100,000, but anything over $100,000, you're not protected. So we do have insurance to cover that. But when banks get to that point where they're failing, the whole system is failing, you may not get the Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation to pay that $90,000 or whatever it is. But it should ask you, how is it possible that I made this money? I had to do actually something of real value to make this money, but I need insurance on my money?
Yeah.
Like, how is that possible? Unless there's something wrong with the system.
It does seem it works on faith, right?
Yeah.
If things are going well and the collective mythos is things are going well, then you pull your money out of the bank. If if there's, and what do they call them, bank runs back in the day with the panics, everyone trying to put their money out, they're like, we don't have all the money.
Exactly. And so that's another thing that banks are always concerned about is bank runs. But again, if we all went to our banks and pulled all our cash out, couldn't do it. We'd get about maybe 2% of all the money out, because most of it, over 97.5% in Canada, is digital. Yeah. And the rest, like in Canada, there's about a little over $100 billion in actual banknotes that are in circulation, and that's it. So, and the rest of it is digital money that's floating around. So you actually had to pull out your cash, you wouldn't be able to do it. It's not enough cash there.
Wow. I knew that. I didn't realize it was somewhere close to 2%. That's incredible.
Yeah. And it gets less and less each year. So the way I calculate it is with monetary aggregates. So, and cash is so insignificant, they don't even have a special aggregate just for cash. So it used to be that M0 was cash, right? Yeah. Real actual banknotes. But now it's morphed in Canada. Our least, or the most liquid asset is M1 plus, and actual banknotes are a component of M1 plus. So if you take the actual cash in circulation and you compare it to M3, which is the rest of money in circulation, what we consider, liquid money that we can convert to cash real easily. And it comes out to about 97.5% is digital, and less than 2.5% is cash, and it gets less every year. Like I checked it 2 years ago and before that, but every year it becomes less.
Kind of sounds like the true value of the dollar. So like here in 1913, if you were to have held on to a dollar, there's a Warren Buffett statement, it'd be worth 4 cents buying power. It'd have 4 cents of the same buying power. And I mean, to me, some of those things seem like optics, like, the price of gold is going up. Is like, isn't that just in reference to the dollar that's going down? I mean, like, so sometimes these things are confusing to me. I had a friend who was saying, like, I wouldn't keep any money in a savings account in the bank, because in a way it may look like the same number, but it may, for all intents and purposes, be dropping in value over time in actual purchasing power. And maybe that's just a trend over time, but I mean, I definitely want to talk about inflation. And there was one question: is inflation even considered? Is it a consideration when creating new money?
Yeah, it has to be. So what PNC proposes is, so create money debt-free for productive purposes, like Medicare for all. So instead of creating money with a debt instrument attached to it, like a bond or a treasury bill, just put that in a ledger, put it into the government's account, and spend that money into existence. So that money would go to maintenance of hospitals, doctors, nurses, fees, all those types of things. And then, of course, that's actually good for the economy too, because that money, again, has a multiplier effect, because the money gets respent, because the doctor, he buys a car, goes to the lake, goes to the restaurant, those kinds of things. The restaurant people, they spend that money that they get because, the money's not owed to anybody. It's free flowing money. So that's one, a solution. To me, that's like the first step. And if people could get used to the idea, then we can just expand it so that we really don't need, for any kind of public purpose, to advocate, money creation by the Bank of Canada. because most things in public purpose are productive and they're valued, but leaning towards the future, like say parks or something like that. Other things like say welfare, you have to be careful with that because again, if you that's a tricky subject, welfare. You want to have programs in place. See, it would be different. Like if you put money into welfare, at least I would like to see it, is you put in things that can help people get on their feet. So you fund programs, educational programs, which brings up another thing about education. The fact that, people are in debt like $400,000 to go to school is absurd. And it wasn't always like that either. Like when the dollar bought the most, biggest bang for your buck, tax rates for the ultra rich were up around 90%. But they've co-opted the financial system, and of course, it's just simple greed. Again, human nature. So,
yeah. So when you're mentioning, progressive money, Canada, the concept of debt-free money issued directly from the Bank of Canada for productive purposes, for the public good, and you're saying things like healthcare. What would be the extreme opposite side of that? Is it speculation?
Not speculation, but let's say if the Bank of Canada created money so everybody in welfare would have $100,000. That would be an extreme example of it. Unfortunately, people on welfare, unfortunate as those circumstances are, the money has to go into programs that can help them get on their feet and make them become a productive member of society. So that's where the money should be funneled, not just giving the money to buy boats and cars like, the commercialist kind of mode is.
Yeah, understood. And it really does seem like, the money, it really does have to flow somewhat intelligently through the economy. It can't just flow in any which way, is what you're saying. Like, if you give them, perhaps they would spend it, and that would bring up the economy a little bit. But I was just learning, I forget who it said, Ludwig von Mises said something about a crack up boom, like before a collapse of a system. Some people see the writing on the wall, so they go out and they buy up reserves of food and whatever. And there's this not artificial, but there's this tiny boom economically right before, because everyone's panic buying, is not really the way to reignite the economy. So what you're saying, give people on welfare $100,000, it would be put back into the economy for sure, but that wouldn't lift them out of the poverty line, correct?
Exactly. So it has to be, towards education, helping them as people. It's a human thing, to make their lives better. So, I would endorse like programs that actually help people. Giving people $100,000 does not help people unless they're in kind of extreme circumstance at one point in time. But to get that over time, then of course that does devalue money. So the old thing of chasing too much money, chasing too few goods and services.
Yeah.
So those kind of considerations have to be put in there. But there really is, that is the only restriction as to how much money you can create is inflation and the productive capacity of the country. Those are the two things, nothing else. That's all that you have to be concerned about. And then once the people got used to and expanded this money creation process for all government services, anything that benefits people in general, right? That money should be created debt free. That's the PMC proposal.
So with that, just to help me understand, is this also a method for, because every country is now has some massive national debt. Could this go towards solving that problem too?
Absolutely, because all debt is related to government securities. So, by the way, Canada is the best debt to GDP ratio. So that's a common way of, comparing debts across different countries. But that's also a poor way. That's another thing that has to be changed. How we look at our banking and financial system is that GDP is a prime driver. And again, this encourages growth because you always want more spending, commercialism. And of course, that's counter to people's mental health and the environment. So all that this is one step. And if we could get in that door and start doing this, like the transition plan for Progressive Money Canada, and the way I explain it in the transition video is the Bank of Canada already does this to some degree. The United States is different. They'd have to change part of the Federal Reserve Act, Section 14B. They'd have to kind of rewrite it. It's been changed many times in the past, and they actually did do it at one time. But this is the tricky part that people need to understand, that the Bank of Canada acting as the fiscal agent for the government sometimes creates money for the government by acquiring securities from the government. So it tries to be as neutral as possible, but right now it takes in about 13% of all government security issues. And that money, some of that money goes directly into the government's account that can be spent. Now, the interesting part of it, and I explain it in the transition video, is that because the Bank of Canada does not hold retained earnings, it doesn't have any profit. It doesn't keep a profit. Any kind of profit it does make is returned to the government. So in essence, it's the government borrowing from itself. If they just keep like adding the balance sheet, and this is another thing I don't want to get in. We could do another thing, like just more technical. But the balance sheet, they're really concerned about expanding the balance sheet. And to me, it's not an issue if the securities are directly issued from the government. Now, if they're on the secondary market, yes, it is an issue, and it does provide more asset inflation opportunities for banks, because when they purchase these securities on the secondary market, those are ones that are already issued by the government, then that increases the liquidity in the system, which means, again, banks have more money. And what do they do when they have more money? They speculate because they're trying to maximize profit. So you get this positive feedback loop for banks that, this is what they're designed to do. I like to call it negative feedback, but the correct term is positive because it reinforces the idea, but the whole thing is negative with regard to the public good.
Yeah.
So this is a very difficult concept, and you can learn about how the Bank of Canada operates too in our central bank on the Progressive Money Canada page. So if you go to our central bank, all these documents, I have them highlighted so you can quickly scan to support everything that I'm saying with regard to how it operates. And that's one of the most important things to understand about the Bank of Canada as a financial institution differs from banks, because the central bank is not designed to make a profit.
Okay, interesting. And that's slightly different than here, because the Federal Reserve System does make, what is it, 6%?
No, it's actually very close. And again, it's more complicated and are like different things with the Federal Reserve System itself. But the Federal Reserve does the same thing. Any major profits, or like for seniors, for example, I could get into seniors. Seniors is just the amount of interest that the banks will make backing banknotes. So on the balance sheet, whatever banknotes in circulation, they have to balance it with assets. And that's usually in normal operating conditions without all this QE and stuff. That is the major holding, is banknotes. So they have to balance it with assets on the other side of the sheet. And again, this is just a human creation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we could have money just put on ledgers saying, okay, this amount of money is circulating in the economy. Inflation's a problem. Okay, let's reduce some of the money in circulation. Let's increase taxation. And not only does it provide, a tax inflation, but all that money goes to good government programs that help people. rather than banks increasing profits.
Yeah, agreed. I was even just recently looking up at, GDP. I think it was originally the original concept was somewhere in England, but in 1934, GDP, here in the United States, like after World War One, and then by 1944, it was the main metric to understand economic growth. And now today, it's almost like an addiction. We have to have this growth or else. Um,
Yes.
and it's pretty interesting because, like, again, I'm still learning on these topics, but all this growth year after year has its unsustainability
Yeah.
point. It's tethered at all
Yeah.
to resources or to reality.
Exactly. And again, I covered in that essay that I produced with endorsed by the economic staff at Selkirk College and Steve Keen. So basically, there's about 6 components, 6 problems, 6 major problems, but there's others too. But the 6 major ones are, the profit motive, the fact that banks don't create the interest that needs to be paid back,
Mm.
the growth imperative, the concentration of wealth, the unstable banking system, and the boom and bust cycles, which we've kind of covered briefly. So that's why you don't want commercial banks creating money, and how it's counter to the public interest, because they don't care what happens. A lake gets dirty or something like that and polluted. If there's no profit in it, it doesn't mean anything to a bank.
Yeah, it blows my mind, and I'll let you hop in here, Gordon. But like, it blows my mind the more I learn about, what should money be tethered to, and so at least Nate Hagans is talking about, like, it's energy, because if money's going to do anything, whether it's muscle energy or ox-drawn energy or coal energy or something like that, it's energy that at least makes the infrastructure run to some degree.
Can I
And,
expound on that?
yeah, please.
Okay, so yeah, energy is a factor, but it can be more simply put. To me, I think that kind of confuses the issue a bit. So basically, but you can use energy as a component. For example, say, Ben, you get a $10,000 loan, right? So the bank types the numbers into the database. Now you have $10,000 in your bank account, and the bank has the loan on its books. So unlike a bank that gets to create the money out of nothing, the bank doesn't create any value in that number. It's you. So, Ben, you actually have to go and do something in society. You have to actually provide some kind of good or service to earn that $10,000 plus the interest to pay the bank back. So that is actually what backs money today. Is it's trust inscribed. It's your belief that this money is value and that it's worth your effort to go out there, get a job, and do something productive so that you can get that money and pay it back.
Yeah.
That's what makes money.
And I appreciate that, and I understand, like, the most people, when you say money, you're thinking the joules to dollars ratio or something along those lines. It's some kind. I have to go out and do something, so I need to eat my calories so I can burn off those hydrocarbons in that way.
Yes.
But I guess the reason I was going there is because this gap between reality and the price of certain things, especially oil, and perhaps I'm biased because lately I've been listening to this one podcast that's
Okay.
$87 for a barrel of oil. Does that factor in anything other than extraction? Does it factor in the production, the shipping? Does it factor in the pollution? How to get it back to a neutral impact on ecology? The way we value oil, is that real? Because then everything else, like if we're going to ship goods and things along those lines, that takes the energy, and that is priced accordingly in my mind. So you wanted to say something there.
Yeah. So with regard to oil and gas, and inflation, so we'll cover both of those at the same time. So it's not that difficult to actually understand what inflation is, and it's the actual underlying causes that are difficult to ascertain. So, for example, anytime the government spends money on people that helps them, it's a problem. Like you really get this from you get this from mainly right wing commentators that at any time, like there's any kind of spending like welfare or something to help people, it's a problem. Where are you going to get the money from? It's always the same talking point. Where are you going to get the money from? They never ask that question when you get like $3 trillion in tax breaks for the rich. They never talk about, well, where are you going to get
the money? Or a new war.
Yeah, or a new war. That question is never raised. So with regard to inflation, so I actually looked at the data. So I have reports that I could forward to you guys if you want. So basically, it's a report by the Consumer Price Index in Canada. That's where I get most of my statistics. And of course, for some people that don't trust the government, I mean, it's the only reliable source of information that you can get. And these are people just like you and me. They go to work and they compile statistics. And it's not a cabal. It's just normal people. And anyway, so the CPI is very reliable. So I did a comparative analysis from December of 2020 to 2021. And so, of course, all this talk about, well, the government's spending all this money. That's why we have inflation. People that just don't look at the numbers. It's just their talking points. And unfortunately, usually from the right wing. But anyways, when you look at the numbers, gasoline prices rose like 33.3% over that year. And of course, there's a knock-on effect because whenever gasoline prices go up, transportation goes up. Mm-hmm. And of course, that was up 8.9%. And other parts of the energy sector, like electricity and natural gas, they went up about 21% over the same time period. And in November of that year, it actually rose like, I think it was 43% in November. So did the money supply all of a sudden go down, when it hit December, when it dropped from 43% to 33%? That statistic right there alone tells you this cannot be a monetary phenomenon. Research at the Bank of Canada shows that anytime they make like a rate change, they can't tell if it's actually made a change until like a year and a half to 2 years later. So it's a very slow process to figure out, if the money supply is actually affecting inflation. So it's very clear what caused the inflation. Energy prices. It drove almost all the inflation that we're currently feeling. That, in combination with supply chain problems, that was also an issue. And extreme weather events during the growing season that also included increase in food costs. So almost none of it, almost none of this inflation had anything to do with any kind of benefit. In Canada, we had CERB benefits for people that couldn't go to work because of restrictions in COVID. That had almost nothing to do with the increase in prices. But you'll hear these talking points going on, and you show them, okay, well, this is what the data tells me. And that's what I am. I'm a quantitative analyst. Qualitative, I like to use qualitative too, but you need to have the quantitative data to support what you are saying. So, that's it in a nutshell. That's an asset inflation. So again, because the Bank of Canada bought up about $450 billion off the secondary market to increase liquidity in the various markets, even provincial bonds. It had quite an extensive purchasing program to help people or help banks, not directly people, but banks. And again, all this liquid money in the bank's hands, what do they do with it? They speculate. And about, like I say, 20% of the property sales, residential properties over that year was by investment companies. So that's what caused our inflation. And the United States is almost directly parallel to Canada in every way. So that's what the main thing that drove inflation. So anybody that tells you anything that government spending caused it, they don't know what they're talking about. And all you have to do, I can forward that report if you guys want to give you, because
Well,
the United States is going to be very similar.
and it makes total sense too, considering how much the petrodollar, how much our dollar is pegged to petroleum. So when petroleum is experiencing volatility, you'd see a knock-on effect, but that would be the key underlying factor.
Yes. And again, we are very dependent on oil and gas to drive our economy. So every time there's a price increase or decrease, not usually the decrease doesn't affect us as much, because prices generally don't drop as fast as they rise, as you're well aware of.
Mhm.
So we have to realize that yes, we have to be transitioning away from fossil fuels. That's another thing, to be energy independent. But it also means that we have to do with less.
That is the prime point of this podcast that I've been listening to. Again, I don't want to like over harp on it, but just to give my fair due to Nate Hagen's the Great Simplification podcast, is what he's looking at. He's really not trying to like be a doomsayer and say that what's coming is a collapse. He's saying like I'm looking at potentially even just like we need to consume a third less in the coming decade or so, because let's just say in America, around the world, we're consuming 100 million times faster of our reserves of hydrocarbon fuel than we're able to extract it. I think it peaked out around the 70s, and now there's diminishing returns since the 70s. And that's where, at least he says, and this is my understanding from him, that to kind of cover over that's where the central banks kind of come in, and it can kind of like keep the economy going. Whereas in fact, what has gotten our economy to where it was so quickly is the dollar, or is oil. What kind of like it exploded the economy. So, like, to me, what he's saying, again, not looking at doom, is we definitely need to consume less in the coming years. And what he feels is like we really have to start thinking also in terms of social capital, and what would it be like as an individual to consume less? Like, do I really need to be on my phone while the computer's on, while the TV's on, the air conditioning's running in the other room, lights are on over in the shop, but nobody's in there? We're not quite tethered to reality in that way. And what he sees, and I'm curious, I know this is a little off topic to where we were going, but do you see the same inevitability point coming soon, that like everything's great, and it's running smoothly until it can't run the way that it has been, and there's at least some kind of a correction? Do you see a correction like this coming, at least soon?
I don't see the regular population taking a real active role. It'll be forced upon them.
Yeah.
If you look at any kind of environmental thing, it's always when shit piles up in your own backyard, then you're going to do something about it. So out of sight, out of mind. So it's through everything that you said about Nate is, yeah, so I agree with it. And plus anybody who's I also took like a environmental science course, York University, when I lived in Toronto. And so the same thing, they cover all that. And that's why, I feel incredibly lucky just to be born when I was born, where I was born, to be, living where I am now. It's mainly luck that got me here. I didn't do anything special. I just kind of lived within my means. And, I built my house or whatever, again, because I didn't want to be a slave to a banker. There's no way I was going to take a mortgage out on a bank. But if I lived in different circumstances, like half the world is, I wouldn't have these opportunities. So there's nothing special about me. I was just plugged into the system, and I went on for the ride. And just like you probably came from, I don't know what your background is really, but we have to realize how lucky we are. But there's a cost to our situation, because for every convenience that we have, it costs somebody somewhere on the other side of the world something. And you have to ask the question, Do I want to give up my comforts? Honestly, I kind of like being comfortable, and you know, I, I, I'm a minimalist, but at the same time, I don't want any of my comforts taken away, um, and that means that there's somebody that's going to be suffering somewhere because of my selfish attitude. Um, but that's how most people. I'm just a little more honest than most people about it.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. We seem to outsource what we don't want to do here, and sometimes it's because like just dirtier jobs what we think we're above, but it's a part of the greater organism, and it's like if we don't agree with it, so let them do that over in that country, but it's still it's impacting someone somewhere, and in the greater scheme of things it's impacting the whole. We're just
Yeah.
Globalization.
yeah.
Yes, globalization, which is to me is a bad thing. It's we should actually always be localized first. So really the opposite of globalization. Like Canada could be self-sufficient in every way, food, um, oil and gas, um, but we're not. For example, we buy gas from the Saudis because it's already refined and it's cheaper than to produce it in the tar pits. Um, so this globalization, which is, there are some benefits, like people directly attached to it, but overall, I believe that a country should be independent if it can, should be self-sustaining first, then go into trade after that. Once your country or your local area is everything's working, tickety boo or whatever, then you can start going to different areas. But the way it is now, and again, the whole thing that drives all these different markets is oil, because the major component of transportation is these shipping containers going all over the world. We're like 2 or 3 weeks from having no food on your, if all the transportation stopped, there'd be no food on the table in about 2 or 3 weeks. So we're riding on this razor's edge, and we just become complacent because we're just used to it. Again, we don't know what's going on, right? I go to the store and I buy food at the grocery store. That's where I get my food from. And I don't care how it's produced or where it comes from.
Right. And historically it's been there, so there's not this thing fresh in our mind that well, make sure you have some at home too, because historically in our minds it's just always been there. And when you say thinking local, bless you, thinking local, it's interesting that like no one person knows how to make a smartphone, right? It's this combination effect, and it's so complex that if you were to have to break it down to like, yo, I have all the parts, can you put this together? It doesn't seem to work that way. And when you think more locally, I guess what it sounds like to me is keep it simple. If you keep it local, you at least can wrap your mind around like what the economy of this is. But when it's global, you just don't think in the same ways of like what's sustainable here. Well, oh, it just seems to work, even though it's not sustainable even here. It just seems to work because at present we're exporting the problem somewhere else. And man, like, well, go ahead. And I know Gordon, you had something you wanted to.
Yeah, well, just something that I think is a key thing that's been kind of underlying throughout this a couple times I've heard it brought up is the term incentives. And I think a big issue with our current system is it's incentivizing basically what we would consider a lot of immoral or unethical actions, a lot of very self-serving, greedy actions based on this underlying sort of assumption that we had talked about, I think, before the pod about, Adam Smith and sort of these animal spirits. But I'm just curious, sort of, Jeff, sort of like what are some of the key incentive issues you see in the current system versus a new system or sort of these new solution orientated ideas you've been working with? What would you see as like, because I've seen TED Talks about people discussing better measurement indexes, right? Versus the GDP having a happiness index or a, fulfillment index, insert whatever name. But a lot of it I realized is my first class in microeconomics or macro, they say, pollution is an externality. And it's like, okay, so what the fuck does that mean? Like are going to act like pollution doesn't exist because it doesn't fit within our, algorithm or our equations to do this, and use these Latin terms to say everything constant and all this. It's like, this is not grounded in reality, which is another thing you've spoken to and bring up on your website. But kind of hit on those two things, just the incentive issues within the current system, and then also sort of the measurement issues with the current way we measure things, and how that could sort of maybe we had better versions of that. We, people really are very much affected by the systems they live within. There's two components here. There's the individual, and then there's the group sort of system.
So the incentives currently is profit. So, and again, as we've already established, profit is not always consistent with the public good. So we've given away this extraordinary privilege for banks to create money, and their main motivation to create or give you a loan is if they think you can pay it back plus interest. That's their motivation. Whereas we could create a new dynamic where the money creation process is open, transparent, and we have to constantly monitor it. So everything has to be monitored. And again, a lot of people argue against government control. I have no problem with government. I have a real problem with corporations and profit. So the best things that I get out of life and the services I get are usually government oriented. They're not from a private corporation, but it's been demonized like the government. And again, these are kind of right-wing talking points because the people at the top of this financial pyramid, they're the ones who benefit by the existing system. They don't want to change it. I mean, it benefits them. And as long as they can kind of keep the population dumbed down, create a bunch of fear and conflict over nothing, and that's the way they keep this, this obvious thing to me, which is our real problem, is controlling the money supply. It means that we have to have direct input.
Right.
And that's like in that second video that you saw, Ben, on the homepage, that's when you get into more of the specifics of how monetary form would evolve. So, I recommend that the Bank of Canada, and I'm kind of looking into this right now, they could reorganize their board of governors or the board of directors with a new mandate to create money. So it wouldn't be something that every year you have to go to a budget committee and decide, well, where are we going to get the money from? So this would really simplify how the whole thing operated, because we would say, okay, well, we're always going to have money for Medicare for all. So we're going to constantly look at it. Like there has to be oversight. Humans, we cannot be trusted with something that powerful. So there has to be it has to be completely transparent. And in Canada, it's like the most transparent financial institution in all of Canada is the Bank of Canada. So, every week they publish their balance sheet and among a whole bunch of other different information. So they're the easiest to see what's happening. Whereas the privately owned commercial banks, they publish these reports like once quarterly, so once every 3 months. So you really can't see what's actually happening. And I talked about liquid requirement ratios, the reporting. They only do those every 3 months. So we can't see exactly what's happening inside the private banking system. So we had this politician, Andrew Scheer, which is a conservative, he'd be equivalent to a Republican in the United States, that pulled this stunt in front of Parliament demanding that the Bank of Canada be audited. And the Bank of Canada, you go to the website, it's the most transparent financial institution that exists in Canada. But again, it's to reinforce that talking point that government spending is causing inflation. The guy said that, there's no clue. But that's this voting base, like, politicians, they speak to their voting base, and that's what people want to hear. So there'd be a lot of it with education. Start with your show, Ben. Like, I'd like to come back and maybe on a different topic or something, but this topic has to be talked about. It has to be get public acceptance. And as you know, it can be confusing because of the way it's taught in as Gordon. He's taken these same courses, like he alluded to some of the things in economics are just bizarre, like some of the concepts. It's not just the banking, but a lot of economics teaching is wacko too, not based in reality. For example, if an economist, like a neoclassical economist, if his models don't reflect how the economy is working, the economist will probably say there's something wrong with the economy. So, because it doesn't fit with my model.
Yeah, it's a lot of confirmation bias. It's a lot of people using their own statistics to validate their own theories.
But they're short on statistics, though, Gordon. Like when you look into it, it's more a theoretical construct. And then what they do to legitimize it is they attach a mathematical relationship to it. And that's something that you would have seen over and over again. And, when they're trying to explain concepts, then they'll create a graph and a mathematical relationship based on a false premise.
Yeah.
On the topic of transparency that you were just mentioning, what are your thoughts on the blockchain and stuff like the blockchain being used for that transparency? Is that a topic you get into at all?
Yeah, I have a page dedicated to it on the website. So if you go to central bank digital currencies, you'll see it there. And I'm against it for a variety of reasons, especially with the private sector, like how much energy it actually consumes. So it's a very dirty thing, like certain cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, the volatility of it. So it's not a really suitable replacement for money. I'll give you an example for that is when Elon Musk was really hot on Bitcoin, bought a bunch of Bitcoin goes up. All of a sudden, he has a change of heart. He sells all his Bitcoin goes down.
Yeah.
So it's really not, a good measure of exchange. And plus, main people don't accept it. Like, in order to spend most of your, say, Bitcoin, if, say, you got lucky and you got in at the beginning, Bitcoin went up and you sold it, what do? You change that into the currency in the United States. It would be the US dollar. In Canada, it would be our loonie. So it's all to do with speculation.
Mm-hmm.
And who's involved in all the big trades? Oh, there's people. The banks are starting to get involved in, trading cryptocurrencies and that kind of thing. Speculators. So to me, we already have digital money. So we just have to understand it. And I hope that the whole digital thing goes under. But people are convinced, and they've bought into it, and there's a lot of momentum. So, like central banks all over the world are guarding against that, and so they're watching it closely. So, if it comes to a point, and this is the biggest threat, is if, say, cryptocurrencies, like you're exchanging, say, going to the restaurant, and you're actually buying your meal with cryptocurrencies, and cash becomes used less and less. Then central banks will consider producing their own central bank digital currency.
Yeah, and then they can start integrating these social credit scores too.
Yeah, so that's another thing too. Is again, and if they did that, there's all kinds of other problems associated with that.
Yeah.
So I still say cash is king, even though there's it does feed to the criminal element. But if you have like a digital currency, say by a central bank, then sure, it's going to stop crime and stuff, but they can track everything that you do.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a privacy issue. Whereas cash, I don't know. I always like to have a little bit of cash. It's kind of secure and they can't track what you do with your cash. So, and I may have bought some things and did some exchanges, like sold some lumber to somebody. This is just theoretical, just in case the CRA or the Revenue Association is watching me right now. Theoretically, like I, sold some lumber to a guy that I had some excess lumber, so I took it in cash and I didn't report it.
Those are
theoretical. So those kind of like convenient transactions, but that is excellent for your local economy. So your local economy. So now this guy, he has this money, and now he's going to go spend it somewhere in the local economy. So I still think cash, even with its problems with criminals using cash and stuff to avoid taxation and stuff, but at the same time, cryptocurrencies, they also use cryptocurrency to avoid paying taxes. So that's also on the CBDC page. So no, I'm not hot on crypto.
Okay. So my question to you, how much money, and maybe this is just for Canada, but how much money should be created and how should it be distributed? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, it depends on the program. So if you started with our medical system, you can see that every year we pay about 22% of all our federal taxes goes toward the medical system. So we could start there, and we could create that money debt-free, put it into the medical system, and there would also be a kind of a little bit of a boon, help the economy too, because people would be paying 22% less in income tax. So they'd have more spendable income. And again, for consumerism, but again, that's a wrong way to look at it, right? Because we want to be spending less, but at least they'll be able to use the money to help theoretically on better causes, not just, improving their own lot. So there's a philosophical thought that has to go into it too. What are we going to do with this increased money that we have on hand? Are we going to create it for the public good, like including my benefits? What am I going to do with that extra money? So it has to be like a national mind reset of how we look at money. And money should be not made for profit. It should be made for the public good. So that would be the start point. So whatever the costs are now, and again, it's pretty straightforward, is 22% of the federal taxes, and then we continue with oversight. We keep watching, make sure nobody's trying to rip off the system because we're human beings. It's going to happen. And then we take the next step. Okay, what's the next highest cost? Well, maybe welfare is something. You could create it for welfare, but we could funnel that money creation into programs that help people on welfare to get them off welfare.
Would this
and then it just goes on and on.
Would this be through like something like a NEED Act, or how exactly would
Yes. So first of all, Canada is a little more advantageous than the United States because they'd have to change this one section of the Federal Reserve Act, Section 14B. It's been rewritten many times. Like if you punch it up, Gord, like the Federal Reserve Act, Section 14B, you'll see all the amendments. This is huge. And there's an excellent paper by a guy named Garbade, Kenneth D. Garbade, who worked at the Treasury as an analyst, and he worked in the primary market. He just published a book actually last year. I'm probably going to get it. But this paper explains how previously the Federal Reserve did purchase securities directly from the government, which is what I'm suggesting the expanding usage of. So if you just rewrote it the way it was before, you could do the same type of thing as Canada is capable of. But you do need something from Congress to say that, okay, we're going to do this. And just like Canada needs a parliament mandate from Parliament to change it. So, but that's all it would take. The actual technical part of it is actually the simplest part. It's the political part that's difficult to get people to accept that this idea is legitimate and could be done.
Yeah, because what you're up against then are the commercial banks and the interests that they influence. And
trillions of dollars.
The influence are partly the story that's told through the media and those talking points you were talking about.
This is why I think you should start with a central bank. And I had this is the reason why I'd like to start with the central bank, not even talk about commercial banks. Just talk about money creation for the public good. And once we start creating more money for the public good, then we can start to rein in the private banking sector. And again, it has to be with an attitude. Yeah, okay, well, what do private banks actually do? Okay, how do they help? When the Bank of Canada say, we've already got these programs in place like Medicare for All, okay, what do we really need commercial banking sector for? Okay, well, still you want to, if you save some money and you want to buy a boat or whatever, then commercial banks still would serve that purpose. It's just, if you took the money creation process away from a commercial bank, they would have to get their money from the Bank of Canada. So you could have incentives drawn into that. For example, say for a boat or something, you could say provide a 0% loan from the Bank of Canada to the commercial bank to give to the consumer. But on the flip side of that coin, say if it was for speculation for property. So that's another big issue, is property ownership. So say there's speculators are speculating on this property, so they're leveraging whatever they have, whatever equity they have, and they want a loan to buy this property for speculation. Well, then the Bank of Canada could flag that and say, okay, if you're going to give this guy this money, we're going to charge you, say, 2%, whatever interest that the bank is charging, and the Bank of Canada is charging, that goes back to the government and goes to programs that help people. So that way you could have, the speculation would be punished in essence. So it would be discouraged.
Right.
So
Right.
you charge like interest rate. And on top of that, say for a loan, say for a small business, it's a legitimate business and the guy gets a loan from the bank, 0% interest. The Bank of Canada could also punch in sort of debt forgiveness, saying that, okay, it's a business, it's local, okay, the guy's doing good. There could be a bit of debt forgiveness attached to that, like a percentage or whatever. That could be worked out. But for speculators, the bank would be totally liable for that. So they would be less incentivized to give out loans for speculation.
What's your thoughts on a speculation tax? Or what's your best way, I guess, to either disincentivize or some way mutually symbiotically work with speculation?
Yeah, there's been lots of people that suggested that, and also on a trading tax.
Right,
So
high-
every
high
time there's a
liquidity.
trade, so every time there's a trade, there's like, say, it wouldn't be very much, but it really stacks up the number of trades every day, like on the stock market,
Right.
that would be gone into government programs that help people. So again, that would be, of course, financial system, any kind of thing that helps people, they're not interested in. They're only interested in maximizing
Yeah.
profit.
We can't profit off people unless you're selling their data.
Yeah.
I mean,
Systems evolve, and I'm not sure what year or around what era it was that the speculation financial sector of the economy grew, and now far bigger than the real economy. I mean, these things have to evolve.
Yeah, there's actually I have there's a guy named Bernard Lietaer. In fact, you go in pros and cons of banking. You can pull that up, Gord, and you go down to Warren Buffett's kind of piece on Warren Buffett, and he talks about speculation and how much is actually, yeah. So the monetary expert Bernard Lietaer, you can read that there if you want. That's it.
monetary expert Bernard Lietaer estimated for 2010 that of the $4 trillion traded daily in currency transactions, only 2% was of significance for the real economy. Example, for importing or exporting goods and services, the other 98% was used purely for speculation.
There's that number 2% again. That's quite interesting.
I don't know if it's a coincidence or not.
Well, I mean, it probably is a coincidence, but just to show you, it's not like a 30-70 or 80-20 split, even, which would be big, But I mean, 2% for the actual economy, that's a lot bigger than what I was even expecting there. And on the topic of debt, it was just something that I recently found in a Charles Eisenstein article. It says, according to a report by the Jubilee Debt Campaign, since 1970, Jamaica has borrowed 18.5 billion and paid back 19.8 billion, yet still owes 7.8 billion. In that same period.
So this is another part of this. The IMF, they dictate the rules. So they're the ones that bring in austerity measures. And again, this is another thing that's the IMF is horrible for.
And
And again, you should never be getting a loan. Like a country should never be getting a loan from the IMF. And the IMF, with most of like international banks, all originated in the United States. So like the IMF research department, those guys, those are excellent, the guys in the research department, but the actual actions of the IMF are not good. So, they crush economies.
Yeah. I mean, it's modern indentured slavery in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
Well, I feel like we should start reining this one in. And so what you're proposing there, then, in Canada, I feel it has a parallel in America and probably many, if not all, countries that have central banks. Is this correct?
All G7 countries.
All G7 countries. So let's maybe just like recap very simply. This solution would be in basically, and you gave another sequence to it that I didn't understand until you just said it. Like before doing anything about the commercial banks, you just address the central bank, correct?
Yes, right. So you change the mandate. Right now, the mandate for all central banks is basically a backstop for the banking and financial system, but they all also act as a fiscal agent for the government. So let's use that part of it, the fiscal agent as the government, to create money debt-free for the government or the benefit of people. That is the bottom line. And then from there, keep investigating. And, if the system works good, so let's try it out. Your first phase, we'll use it in Canada, we'll use it or in the United States, it would be huge. Use it for your new Medicare for All system, if you guys can ever get that passed. So
you got big pharma over here.
So anyways, that would be the first step, something that people can emotionally grab onto. So to me, that's what I've been attempting to do, is to make my explanations as simple and as understandable as it can, avoid the technical jargon. For example, money creation is just banks. They got they just type numbers into databases. Then we can go deeper into the weeds if you want to know the technical aspects of it, but that's essentially it. This is extraordinary privilege that's been given to banks. And so ignore them for the first part. The first phase, let's empower the central banks. So in the United States, empower the Federal Reserve. And also there's some like online activity again, Jerome Powell caught in the insider trades and stuff, but the Federal Reserve can do very little about inflation. So we already covered what actually caused the inflation.
Yeah.
And the Federal Reserve didn't really they really can't do that much about it. So this quantitative tightening, it's just going to hurt people at the bottom like it always does.
Totally.
So,
I don't know if you heard Jerome Powell after the Jackson Hole, Wyoming symposium, the economic symposium, basically said what's coming is going to cause pain for households and businesses. And I feel like you're exactly right. Their hands are actually tied in many ways. And even Macron, president of
France,
was just basically saying this is the end of an era of abundance, and this is within a couple days of one another saying that. And I'm curious, especially there in France, because they're going to be, experiencing energy crisis sooner than here, at least, especially because what's going on in Ukraine.
Germany,
so,
France.
like, what's that, Gordon?
Germany and France are going to get hit hard. Yeah, they're both. Germany's very reliant on Russian petroleum.
For sure, yeah. So, I mean, that's definitely what I'm seeing. That that writing on the wall. The last point that I want to land on is, so for the public good, how, like, do you have and maybe this is what you meant by like oversight, proper oversight of like, so like, what is determined for the public good? That's going to be then, basically the political talking points and how that gets determined, what is for the public good. But enumerate what you feel. You already said healthcare, but are there a couple other things that you think are just no-brainers off the top? This is what it should go towards, the infrastructure of
education, infrastructure.
Yeah, and those are very, and they're
so
very,
Medicare for all, education, infrastructure, and programs that help people.
those are very bipartisan over here as well. You know, these are these sort of universal things that are very like, there's certain issues that are very politicized, but there's some that are no-brainers, and a lot of people, that's the hardest thing to explain. Like, why have we not fixed our roads and bridges that are getting D+ grades every week from inspector? You know, this is not a left or right thing.
Yeah.
It's not profitable.
Yeah, all polling in the United States, supports all these popular things like Medicare for all, even Republicans.
Yeah,
I mean,
populism.
it's immensely popular, but it doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Because it doesn't benefit the people that are getting paid off by, their donors. So basically, most politicians are, with the exception of a few, are mostly dependent on their donors for their support. So again, they're not there to help their constituents. They're there to make money, maybe get a good job after they serve their term in office. But
a little insider trading.
Complicated.
A little insider trading. Like
Sorry?
Pelosi. Sorry, I was just saying, like, do a little insider trading, like Pelosi.
Yeah,
all these,
they're sort of touch with reality, the common person. But everything, money rules, and that's another reason why you want to take control of our monetary system. And again, people get, the government. It's money. It's control of money. The people that control money, they want to keep the system the way it is. And the Progressive Money Canada wants to empower people so that we can have input to how money is created, how it's distributed. And you could do that through like a referendum basis. Like once people got used to the idea that, so you mean the Bank of Canada can create money inflation free and we pay less taxes? Hey, that's great. Can we do some more of it? Once they get the idea, but it's so alien. And of course, the financial industry and banks, they control a lot of the media too. So, and it's not direct, it's indirect, right? So they hire people that say certain things. They know they're going to say certain things, and it supports their position.
Manufacturing consent.
It really is. It's about resetting our minds and realizing, hey, the public banks, we could create money for the public good. We do not need commercial banks or trading or stock markets to do that.
Yeah.
And there's precedent for it. They've done it.
Okay. So the final thing I want to say, and to the point of really getting it into the mindset of people, your thoughts on the best way. So for me as an artist, it's obviously like, well, like what's going to cause people to want to do that? Is it getting a politician to speak about it? Is it making a documentary? To me, like art seems to be able to kind of reach past people who are just not into this information. Like they want a better life, but they don't see it this way. So they're not looking in this direction. And art kind of is this, diffuse spectrum that might inspire people to look in directions. Like, I don't know what your thoughts of Zeitgeist was, but the simple fact that 20 million people saw that and that it brought people's attention to, wait, there's a Federal Reserve. I didn't even know what that was, but it's not federal. And like, that was the power of art to impact 20 million people that were probably not even caring about any of these topics. So your thoughts on how do we get it into the minds that this is something we should go
for? It's going to be a long road. So yeah, art, any way you can spread the message, but the message has to be clear. So hopefully I've helped in clarifying what that message is. So the message is money creation for the public good. Empower the central banks to act on our behalf. not the privately owned commercial banking sector. So the message has got to be simple and clear, and like shows like this, and eventually maybe get on some mainstream. Like I don't particularly like doing this. It's a requirement if you want to try to spread the message. So this is how we do it. Shows like yourself that allowed me this time to explain, what could be. And it actually, the concept is very simple, but politically, that is the part. And so we need a grassroots movement. That's one reason I'm going to the Federal Reserve and started in solidarity with my brothers in the South. And we're not there to, create shit or anything like that. We're just there to, because a lot of people don't really understand the capacity and what the Federal Reserve does. But, they know Jerome Powell's been, sort of corrupt, and they disagree with that. But also just the fact that the Reserve is there is to backstop the banking system. So I'd like to see that changed, and that's what we'll say. So if anybody asks us, or if there's any media there, we'll say, yeah, we want to empower the Federal Reserve to create money for the public good. And then we can go from there. But I think I've provided a simple enough message so that it can be easily understood by anybody. And then if you want to get deeper into the weeds, we can easily do that. And that's what the PMC website's all about. So any kind of question and, counters to this suggestion are on the website. So that's how we do it. Unfortunately, I don't know what's because we're practically invisible. When you consider, I'll give you an example of Twitter. So I'm on Twitter and I have 60 followers or something like that. I just went on in November at the suggestion of some other people. But, you compare that to the Flat Earth Society. The Flat Earth Society has almost 100,000 followers.
Yeah, it's thriving.
So it may be that, hopefully we could get some people, but the only way it'll do is if concerned people like yourself allow a venue for people, and we have to keep saying the same thing over and over again to get people interested and to get some boots on the ground, to get actual people involved. And our numbers right now are dismal. And again, it's because of the difficulty of the topic.
What's interesting is you're talking about the difficulty of the topic. The topic, or the solution is simple, but that doesn't mean that the complexity that we are hypnotized by is a simple fix. So to get our minds back to the simple solution, you have to, it's intricate to untangle the sophisticated web of delusion that we sit under, because I could imagine some of the questions that would come to you would just be I already explained that, and that's why for me, my mind still kind of struggles with these things because I'm more of an artist. So when it comes to these things, there's a certain point where my mind just shuts off and it's why do I want to know this? Oh yeah, it's because it's really important and it influences every aspect of my life and my family life. So yes, I want to understand this. And so that's pretty fascinating right there. Just to touch base on when you said you will be there at the Fed, you're talking about November 5th this year at the New York Federal Reserve building.
Yes.
Okay. We're going to be there as well. So Harrison Schultz, who we had on the show, is going to be there. This is the Occupy the Fed movement. And what's interesting, the one thing that came up into my mind is if people ask you some questions, and perhaps we'll even get this on film, is maybe a difference with this and Occupy Wall Street movement is the talking point that you just said is we want to empower the central bank. How many people at Occupy Wall Street were well, we want to empower Wall Street, so that's an interesting, seemingly paradoxical talking point, which is very interesting. That's actually something that I wasn't expecting coming into this show, that was part of it. We want to empower the central banks, but in a very specific direction.
Yeah, so, to empower us.
Yeah, to empower us, which should be the grand point, which should make sense to everybody. So I just want to give you one last chance. It was such a pleasure to have you on. I would love to have you back on, maybe even closer to November 5th. But if there's anything else that you want to leave the audience with that you feel like we didn't cover, or just food for thought for the future, now's your chance.
Okay, I always like to share this metric with people because again, I try to explain things without you having to know all the details about the financial system. So you're also aware of the increasing divide between the very rich and the very poor. Well, this has a lot to do with land ownership too. So my father in 1966, he bought this big house in Surrey, British Columbia, where I spent my youth. And he bought this house for about $14,000. This big house, full, like there's 3 bedrooms upstairs. There's 4 bedrooms upstairs, a bathroom, big living room, kitchen nook, and downstairs there's another like 3 bedrooms and a huge rumpus room, like a big like activities area and a shop, a nice piece of property. And Dad at that time was working as an instrument mechanic at Chevron Gas, and he was making a little over $8,000 a year. So the cost of the house relative to his annual income was about 1.75 times his annual income. Now I checked that same property, 12720 100th Avenue in Surrey, BC, in 2019, and it was assessed at $866,000. And the average wage of an instrument mechanic at that time in 2019 was $70,000. So the price of the house relative to the annual income is about 12.5 times the annual income. So without knowing anything about inflation, without knowing anything about economics at all, there's something wrong. And that divide continues to increase between, the haves and the have-nots. And it's largely responsible is the banking and financial system.
Very good point. Jeff, I want to thank you so much for your time. This was a nice, healthy, long interview that I feel like we needed to get through. All these points that we went into covered a lot of territory. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time. We definitely look forward to having you back on the show.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. I do have some questions. Is there like a follow-up after we close down here?
Yeah, we'll follow up. Just stay with us.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Eder. Please, all the information is going to be in the show notes. So please do your due diligence, do your homework on this, and reach out to us. Reach out to Jeff with questions if you have it. How to get involved with it, how to help spread the word while understanding that staying very true to the very core of the message with simplicity is the key to getting it through people's thick blinders that we have on just because of the day-to-day. Please go in, check the show notes, make sure that you dive into all this work. And just so all of you know, this is something that I'm getting deeper into. These topics that we're talking about now, I know historically we've gone everything from the highly philosophical to the spiritual to the practical. These are topics that are going to be more and more obvious to people this decade. This is the reason why I even have this show, is because I find it very important for us to be looking at these topics over time. As you know, marketing, it takes 7 to 11, sometimes 15 touches before somebody feels comfortable in making a purchase. To hear something like this, to actually get it through to people, it's not just one podcast and done. This is a conversation that needs to evolve and keep going. So if you want to get involved in it, maybe show up in New York on November 5th at the Federal Reserve Building. And we'll have information about this. We'll have Jeff back on. We'll have Harrison back on. With that being said, just do what you know you were put here to do. And everyone on this, everyone that is an audience member to this podcast, you're here, I would imagine, and I can feel and sense that you're here because you know you were put here for more than just to consume. You were here to give back in some very meaningful way. These are the ways. So please get involved. Don't just consume this content. Do something with this information that you've been given. Gordo and I are here every single Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is live, so we can field some questions. We don't always get to it. This has been a long podcast, but we'll have Jeff back on, and we will field your questions then. But just make sure you keep coming back every Thursday. And if you have any questions or if you want to contribute a little bit more, please just reach out to us. Go to benjosephstewart.com, sign up, become a member. That's where you get access to all the deeper dives, all the awakening protocols. With that being said, I really appreciate all your support. I'll catch you all next time on the Ben Stewart Podcast.
Yeah.